Hello and welcome to The Truth According to, the latest interview in our series of web live stream interviews talking to various people from around the world. Today we're talking with Courtney Vail, who is from the Vail and Dolphin Conservation Group, or the WDC. Courtney, welcome. Thanks for coming on to the show. We're here to talk to you about your organisation, but we're also here to talk about what's happening at the International Whaling Commission. First of all, can you just tell us what is the WDC, what's it about and what it does?
Yeah, Whale and Dolphin Conservation is an international charity that is dedicated solely to the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and their environment. We were established in 1987, and we have global offices in the US, Argentina, Australia, Germany, and the UK. And we campaign and work actively in the field to cultivate local capacity to address whale and dolphin threats, support scientific research, work with governments to develop policy to protect the marine environment, and a whole host of other activities to focus our efforts to protecting these amazing creatures.
Okay, so just tell us, what exactly are the threats? I mean, who is the threat to the whales and dolphins that you are trying to save?
I think we have an internet connection problem.
Okay. Okay, I'll repeat the question. So just tell us, who are the threats? Because you who are the threats to the whales and dolphins?
That's a big question. If we're just focusing on the directed take or the hunting of whales and dolphins, we can look at those hunts that focus on small whales and dolphins, the drive hunts and the coastal whaling that occurs in Japan, for instance, in the form of drive hunts. Global hunts are occurring everywhere, including in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in Asia, and Indonesia. So dolphins really are under assault through directed hunts all over the world. If we look at the large whale species, we're really speaking to a few nations that continue to, quote unquote, be renegade whalers and continue to instigate commercial whaling activities. And those countries really are undermining the International Whaling Commission and the global treaty and moratorium that was established in 1986 to bring a full cessation to commercial whaling. And those countries are primarily Japan, Iceland, and Norway. And there is some whaling, of course, in the US that is labeled Aboriginal subsistence whaling, and in Russia, and in Canada. So the primary commercial whalers, as it stands today, are those three countries that we focus our efforts and attention on, although we seek accountability from all countries in regards to their taking and hunting of all whale and dolphin species.
Okay, so how are these countries, Japan, Greenland, how are they able to do this when the IWC has this moratorium in place?
Well, you have to realize that the IWC is a voluntary body. It's reliant upon the goodwill and the good faith of those countries that are parties to that convention. And currently there's 88 countries that are represented in the IWC. And whaling activities occur under reservation or objection to the moratorium by countries such as Iceland and Norway. And then whaling occurs under another type of reservation, which is the scientific research loophole within the convention, which has allowed to date Japan to continue its whaling activities. Now, the coastal whaling activities that include the dolphin hunts all over the world, they're either legal or illegal through the national laws of those countries, and the IWC, unfortunately, does not regulate nor address adequately the dolphin hunts that occur in coastal waters. So that's one of the weaknesses of the convention. So the IWC is a non-binding treaty organization, and we really have to rely upon the good faith efforts of those countries that participate to seek compliance to the regulations and recommendations of that body, including the scientific committee that's part of it. So Japan, it continues to whale as scientific research. It continues to whale along its coastline in the name of tradition and subsistence whaling. And Norway and Iceland whale under objection to the moratorium, basically. So those three countries really are whaling commercially still to this day.
So are you saying that the IWC isn't fit for purpose in that sense?
IWC has a purpose, and we are also seeking other conventions and agreements to really effectuate global protection around the world. There are other conventions, such as the Convention on Migratory Species and Law of the Sea, and other legal mechanisms that we seek to provide a network of protection across the globe. The International Whaling Commission is the authority, and most of these other conventions defer to that authority. But we understand that there's limitations and weaknesses, and it's a very political body. And on the one hand, having it be very political is a good thing in the hopes that it will be receptive and responsive to public policy, public sentiment, and the collective collaboration of those countries that seek protection for whales and dolphins. But on the other hand, because it is political, it is at risk of being held hostage, basically, by the activities of a few countries that decide to ignore or flout and flaunt the reservations and objection loopholes within that treaty. So renegade countries that don't wish to comply are able to do so. So it's a very, very political body that is susceptible to these actions of a few countries that could undermine the global moratorium and are undermining the global moratorium at this time.
Okay, so you mentioned before about the Aboriginal subsistence whaling side of it, which, you know, still allows whaling but has some kind of restrictions on them. Could you kind of explain the kind of idea around that and where that is used?
Yeah, so the original treaty that was established in 1946 really did not define Aboriginal subsistence whaling, but what has happened subsequently is that through a series of resolutions and workshops and definitions, the current understanding is that Aboriginal subsistence whaling is meant to provide sustenance, basically, for local, traditional, indigenous communities for nutritional and cultural needs. And that's the current understanding within the convention. Now, that, of course, has the susceptibility to be exploited. Over the last couple of years, we've been doing surveys, market surveys within Greenland, for instance. And Greenland and the Faroe Islands are semi-autonomous territories of Denmark. And Denmark, of course, is part of the EU and must comply with the global moratorium on whaling. However, we have seen that in Greenland, for instance, the definition of Aboriginal subsistence whaling now includes the sale of whale meat in restaurants. Over 80% of the restaurants in Greenland offer a variety of whale species to tourists and non-Greenlanders. This, of course, is in violation of the strict definition and the working definition of subsistence whaling. So we see a highly commercialized aspect happening in many subsistence hunts. So it's an opportunity to redefine a different type of commercial whaling, and we're very concerned about that. At the most recent IWC meeting in Slovenia, the proposal by the EU to basically bring more accountability to the Aboriginal subsistence whaling loophole and process within the convention was addressed, and attached to that package of proposals, which made it hard to refuse, was this needs statement for Greenland, which would increase the allowable quota for the numbers of whales to be taken for subsistence purposes, despite the evidence that we provided showing that it truly is a commercial hunt rather than a subsistence hunt at this point, including data extending back several years. The proposal passed, which now means that Greenland will have an increased quota of whales now for the next 4 years. That includes 10 humpbacks per year, 12 fin whales, and about 164 minke whales, and a few bowhead whales. So that means almost 800 whales over the next 4 years will be killed in the name of local subsistence nutritional requirement, despite the fact that much of it is ending up in restaurants and available to tourists. So we're very concerned about this, and across the world there is great sympathy, of course, for the nutritional requirements of indigenous communities, but beyond our concerns for the health impacts of consuming whale and dolphin products, there is the concern that this definition and this need statement that must be presented to the Commission has been exploited, basically. And so now we see that humpback whales will be hunted in Greenland and potentially end up on the dinner plate. And we saw Latin American countries, including the Dominican Republic, where those humpback whales migrate and winter, very concerned about the quota, the increased quota. So again, we do not oppose subsistence whaling. Through our campaigns, we seek accountability, we seek regulation, and we seek the most humane methods, of course, in those hunts. But we desire and demand really a true substantiation of that local need, and we're seeing that is being basically exploited in the instance of Greenland.
So so you say that the quota has been expanded out, but I mean, how do you calculate that? You know, how do you work out how many more you're able to hunt per year? How do you know how that's been calculated?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's really a bone of contention within the Commission as well, and needs to be reformed truly within the Commission. So Greenland's quota is calculated by tonnage rather than by numbers of whales, where it is elsewhere in the world, say in the U.S., where Alaskan and native Inuits take about 60 bowhead whales per year. Instead, in Greenland, they're basing it on tonnage and based on their population. And within a population of about 50,000 Greenlanders, which we're seeing that population actually decrease, and yet the quota for whale tonnage is actually increasing, which is very interesting. That tonnage is based on population. Now, if you look at all of the small cetaceans, including belugas and narwhals and harbor porpoise that are taken in Greenland, all that meat from those small cetacean kills that are not regulated, and there are no quotas set for those numbers, it's not calculated in that total tonnage of whale meat that is used to base the quota upon. So, you know, from 1998 to 2001, we know that about 1,800 harbor porpoises were killed. In the 1990s, about 1,000 narwhals were killed per year in Greenland. And even in 2001 through 2003, 34 orcas were killed. So when we did our surveys in the Greenland markets, we saw orca teeth, we saw narwhal tusks, we saw whale meat from a variety of species, and that was on sale to tourists. So we're hard pressed to see how that is true local subsistence need.
Okay, as a member of the WC, you can tell us sort of how you sort of raise awareness about this, you know, and what you do to try and sort of influence or change people's minds. I presume you were at the IWC meeting.
I was not. My colleagues were. I'm a senior campaigner with WDC and have worked with the organization for 15 years. So I've been to other IWC meetings, but I was not able to be at this most recent one.
Are they actually worth going to there? I mean, you talk just now about the way that the quota was increased. I mean, is being there actually useful? Are you able to influence when you're there, or is it you have to be somewhere else or do other actions?
I think it's critical to continue to participate at the IWC, and especially for a nonprofit organization or advocacy organization or science organization like WDC is. It's very important for our perspectives to be heard. We prepare briefings for the delegates for the different countries. We work with the different countries to develop a position, hopefully a pro-whale position, not a pro-whaling position. So our influence, our knowledge, our expertise is valuable to the delegates, to the parties that ultimately make the decisions in that forum. It's not the only game in town, and I think that many are beginning to realize that on its own, the IWC may not be sufficient enough to protect whales and dolphins completely, and it does come down to each country and their sovereignty and their own regulations and protections in their own coastal waters, where the rubber meets the road and where we work hard as well to build capacity and develop policies that protect whales and dolphins there as well. But it's a highly political forum, and it's draining, but it's necessary, and it still is seen as the authority within the global policy-making arena for whale and dolphin protection. So it's important to be there.
Yeah,
but we do. Oh.
No, do go on.
Well, you also asked what else do we do to effectuate policy globally, and in thinking about whaling, we have a variety of campaigns that are focused on the life cycle of consumerism, from supply and demand. So we work with the public basically to educate them and then encourage them when they travel to Iceland or Greenland or Norway to take a whale watching tour and not sample whale meat in the restaurants. Meet the locals, don't eat the locals is one of the campaign slogans. And so educating tourists when they travel to whaling countries to not participate in consumption of whales, but rather participate in non-consumptive activities like whale watching. We've also worked with supermarkets in the UK and in Germany to educate them about their connection to some of the products that they source to whaling in those countries. So we've worked with supermarkets to have them disassociate with some of the whaling interests in those countries, and that helps as well. So to reduce the market for whale products, we've exposed online sales of whale and dolphin products. We've exposed the diversification of whale products, including whale beer and biofuel in Iceland, where Christian Lofson, the primary whaler in Iceland, has used whale products to develop biofuel to fuel his whaling vessels, and some of the breweries had actually created whale beer. So there's all sorts of ways that these countries are working to try to keep the market for these products alive in the midst of waning public desire and demand for whale meat. So consumption by the public in these countries is going down, but there's still this political obstinacy that persists that keeps these countries whaling. Another example of diversification of whale products is the use of whale meat in luxury pet food products, which is almost obscene when you think about it. So we helped expose that as well and shut down the market over the internet for the sale of pet dog treats made out of fin whale meat. So those are just a few examples of how we work outside of the legal mechanisms out there like the IWC that are at work to stem this trade.
What about in those countries where who are sort of using the loopholes to do this, and they're using the argument of subsistence whaling? So I mean, there's a way of life there. It's consumed there. How would you perceive it to change in a country such as Greenland where it's being consumed? You'd have to get everyone not to use it. It seems like a very monumental task.
It is, and again, we are sympathetic to any true subsistence requirements and nutrition requirements in these countries. We focus our attention on those hunts that are either extremely cruel, unsustainable, or have the evidence that they're not truly subsistence hunts. So take the Faroe Islands for instance, with the grin there, the pilot whale grin that happens annually there, and an average of 700 to 800 pilot whales are killed annually for local consumption in the name of tradition and culture, and those hunts have been going on for a long time. We know that the Faroe Islands is a very modernized and self-sufficient country and has a high level of income and quality of life, high standard of living. And these hunts have a different type of meaning to them in that instance. But even there, we've seen that pilot whale meat is for sale and available in supermarkets. So again, there's becoming a commercial element to those hunts, and there's really not true subsistence requirement in the Faroe Islands. There, it's a different character. And then we go to Japan, where we look at the drive hunts, for instance. Those hunts as well are not truly for subsistence requirement. There's a little bit of local consumption of the dolphin meat there, but the drivers are quite different in Taiji. And those drivers include sourcing alive dolphins from those hunts for captivity, which brings great income to Taiji and the local fishermen. The local fishermen are not reliant upon hunting dolphins for their livelihood. There are a variety of other fish species that they could hunt and do hunt at other times during the year. So it's not a true subsistence need. The idea of culture and tradition is a loose one, and what whaling means to a community is undeniable. If it's been happening for decades or centuries. But again, we have to peel back the surface and the veneer of that claim of tradition a little bit and really look a little bit closer. In Taiji, the mechanized drive hunts really didn't start until the early 1960s. And it started as a result of rounding up pilot whales for captivity. And so it's morphed into a highly mechanized and commercial activity, a highly lucrative activity, not based on tradition or need at this point in time. So those claims are sometimes false. And if you look at the methods utilized in those hunts, they are extremely cruel. And there is room to question and hold accountable and scrutinize those activities, as in any activities that happen around the world by traditional communities. There are a whole host of activities that we could look to in the social realm, whether it's female genetic mutilation or all sorts of traditional activities, and look at them for what they are and shine the light on them and really question whether they're necessary, whether they're sustainable, whether they're humane. And I don't think any tradition is exempt from that kind of public scrutiny and accountability. So that's really where we position ourselves when it comes to subsistence whaling. It's a very difficult position to be in, to actually try to deny true nutritional requirements. We would never do that. What we do is to seek accountability for every individual life, whale and dolphin life, that is taken either for commerce, science, or the dinner plate. And that's where we're coming from in our approach.
Okay. So you talked just there about the dolphin hunts season in Taiji, which starts September through to around April time. I mean, this is your opportunity. I kind of want to know more about that and what exactly happens during that hunt. And if you're watching this and maybe you don't want to know the gory details, then you might want to just turn the sound down a little bit. But could you just tell us exactly what happens?
Yes, and I do encourage the viewers to go to our website, because we do have video. And quite frankly now, because of the occupation of Taiji by Sea Shepherd and other groups, viewers can actually witness on a daily basis live streaming from Taiji, which is a new phenomenon, really. I was in Taiji long before the Cove came out and before this invasion of and preoccupation with Taiji occurred, and before the fishermen started putting tarps over the killing. But viewers can go to our site, I will just add, to actually see the methods that are being utilized. We did conduct a veterinary and behavioral analysis that has been presented to the scientific community and has been published in a journal, a scientific journal, that does detail in excruciating pain the methods that are utilized in Taiji. So
can you just tell us some of, because it's like sort of it's herding dolphins into areas. I mean, what happens?
Yes, that was just a preface to the fuller methods that are used that I'll describe now, but I just wanted to make sure that viewers, because my descriptions are not going to be adequate alone to understand what's happening there. So dolphins are rounded up and herded from sea, sometimes miles out at sea, with boats that utilize long metal poles that the fishermen bang with hammers and stones to create a wall of sound that disorients the whales and dolphins. They are driven, whole families, whole pods are driven miles from out at sea. During that process of driving, many individuals are lost to shock. They're separated from their family members, and many die during that process. We will never know the scope of those deaths because it's impossible to monitor. But we know from the tuna fishery the impact of driving and the stress associated with rounding up dolphins, for instance, in tuna nets. So we have the scientific data that substantiates that concern. That's the driving process. During that process, driven from sea, they are then herded and rounded into a small cove, and sometimes they're held for days before they're slaughtered, or trainers from Japanese facilities and international facilities will come and select a few dolphins to basically send to overseas facilities for Swim with a Dolphin programs. Taiji Whale Museum, Dolphin Base are two facilities right down the road from the Killing Cove, and dolphins are taken there and acclimated to captivity and then shipped off around the world or shipped to over 50 Japanese facilities. Excuse me. So the slaughter process is just one piece of the overall drive hunt process. And because it's so visible to the public as opposed to some of the other hunts that occur around Japan's coastline, it's received a lot of attention. But you have to realize that there are a host of other whale and dolphin hunts that occur annually, all year round, across the coastline of Japan, and that includes handheld harpoon hunts and small type coastal whaling, and those are most likely as excruciatingly as cruel and painful as the drive hunts, but we just can't witness them. The Dall's porpoise hunt in northern Japan, off like Hokkaido, those take even more numbers. Up to 15,000 Dall's porpoise are killed in those hunts, and those use electrified lances, which are harpoons that are fired off the ship's bow and actually electrocute the dolphins upon impact, and then they're reeled back in. So, you know, these are real and true methods that are being used. But the drive hunts have received a lot of attention since The Cove. I'm sure many of the viewers have witnessed that documentary, and because they're so accessible at this point, right there in Taiji in The Cove. So the dolphins then are brought under the tarps, and the method that is used now has been adapted from the Faroese method that uses a spinal lance, which is a long knife that is inserted behind the blowhole, and it is meant to sever the spinal cord. And in the old ways, you know, many years ago, I would say before the Cove came out, and stemming from the early 2000s, the method was to cut ventrally the throat area of the dolphin and have them bleed out. And that's where we witnessed, even National Geographic had a cover photo in the 1970s of the hunt, and just the Cove is filled with red blood, and it's very vivid. In the aftermath of the Cove and heightened scrutiny, the methods have changed, and now using the spinal lance, the incision behind the blowhole is smaller and more discreet, and they actually plug the wound with a wooden dowel, with a wooden plug that prevents the blood from entering the water. Much more cruel a method in not letting the blood be let out from the wound. So in actuality, the current method is more cruel than the old method that was a whole lot bloodier for the public to see. So it's not pleasant to talk about. The dolphins do not die immediately. They can languish 10, 20 minutes, and the video is out there if the viewers want to see it. It's hard to watch, but I do encourage you to. I think it deserves the highest accountability for the methods that are being used, and we are encouraging the scientific community to come forward, and they have, to address this issue, because it's not just a sustainability issue. The thousands of dolphins that are killed annually with no knowledge of the populations of dolphins around the coastline of Japan, there has not been an assessment of dolphin populations, but also the methods being used and the cruelty of those methods. The methods that are being used would not even conform to Japanese regulations for animal welfare that are used for slaughtering domestic livestock. There are strong words in Japanese legislation for domestic slaughter, including prevention of agony, suffering, pain, all things that happen during the drive hunt and to the dolphins. Unfortunately, dolphins fall through the cracks of Japanese legislation, whether it's fisheries, hunting, or the welfare legislation. So we're working hard to address those loopholes, and many people step away from the dolphin hunts because they are legal. Technically, they're legal. In Japan, just like in many countries, the killing of dolphins is either unregulated or legal. And so we're working really diligently to, on all fronts, expose the hunts and work with local Japanese groups to reach the public, to encourage them to speak out to the government, and to not buy a ticket to a captive facility that sources dolphins from the drive hunts. Unfortunately, in Taiji, at the Taiji Whale Museum, you kind of have a perfect trifecta. You have the herding of the dolphins out from sea. You have them held captive in the Taiji Whale Museum, where you can watch them perform and pet them and swim with them. And then you can go to the gift shop within the museum and actually buy whale and dolphin meat. So it's a strange, testimony to, I guess, our ability to compartmentalize our relationship with whales and dolphins. You even have whale and dolphin watching happening right across the bay from Taiji, and the boats come over to Taiji and Dolphin Base, and you can see the dolphins that were rounded up at the cove, their family members slaughtered, and those that survived are held in a pen, and the tourists come and watch them jump out of the water. So our arguments that whale and dolphin watching might be an alternative income or possibility for this community seem lost in the midst of this strange merging of exploitation of whales and dolphins.
So, we can go to the WDC website and we can see these videos and we can watch live streams of it happening. I kind of want to find out what you personally think about all of this when you watch those kind of videos.
Oh, it brings me to my knees, and I think it would anybody. It's really the unspeakable happening when you think about the sentience and the self-awareness of whales and dolphins and the social complexity. I work with a researcher that is analyzing the signature whistles and the sounds that are being made in the cove during this whole process from the beginning to the end, and it's heartbreaking. And we know that each individual dolphin is experiencing extreme suffering and pain during this process, whether it's separation from mother and brother, or whether it's awaiting their fate when they hear the cries of their family members being slaughtered under the tarps. I mean, we know the science, and the science tells us that these animals are socially complex, they're self-aware, and there's, as a result, going to be extreme suffering that's endured during this process. So for me, I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I'm still impacted and affected every time I see what's happening.
So the International Court of Justice ruled that Japan's Antarctic whaling was illegal. Does that count for anything?
It should. It should count for a lot. And it gave a moment of pause, I think, to Japan to reflect upon the notion that they said that they were going to comply with the ruling and that they should comply, but as we're not surprised, they're going to find a way around that. And their way around that is to revise their scientific whaling program to meet the higher level of scrutiny that was established or laid down in that court decision. So as expected, they came to the Whaling Commission meeting with a proposal not only to whale in the Okhotsk Sea to expand their coastal whaling operations, but to seek approval of a revised scientific research plan. And that approval process will take place in the next year, but they announced their plans to whale under a revised scientific whaling program in 2015. So the court justice International Court of Justice ruling gave a temporary, I think, reprieve, but it didn't last very long. A proposal did pass. It was presented by New Zealand that does seek to kind of codify the ruling by the court in seeking the scientific committee's involvement in reviewing the scientific merit of any exemption under scientific research exemption in the commission. So there's obviously a realization that in order for that court ruling to mean anything, there's going to have to be some mechanism within the commission to deal with research proposals, and it will be tried, immediately by Japan's new proposal and new revised research program in the Southern Ocean.
Okay. So we're talking with Courtney Vail from the Vail and Dolphin Conservation Group, the WDC. If you want to get your questions in, put them down the side of the video or tweet us, and we'll throw them to Courtney. Courtney, I just want to ask you about the kind of cooperation you get from governments on this issue, because it's something that happens, for example, with the UK government. It's something that may be perceived to happen far away from the UK. It's not a necessarily an upfront issue. You might have seen the Cove documentary and been shocked by that and then taken a different stance, but then you might not have seen that documentary and not really know. So can you tell us kind of, do governments cooperate with you? Do they take it on board? Do they do anything about it?
Definitely. There are allies out there, and let's face it, most of the world doesn't want to see whales being killed for any reason. And so there's a strong block of countries that seek protection and seek an end to whaling, and they comply with the global moratorium. You have a handful of countries, and actually that number is growing as Japan tries to influence countries in West Africa and the Caribbean, for example, to vote in favor of whaling, whether it's in the name of food security or whether it's in the name of overseas fishing subsidies from Japan. So it's a game of boat buying that happens as well in the IWC, and that's obviously of concern. But most of the world does want to see whaling end, and we do collaborate with governments, and the UK and the US are strong allies on certain issues, but there is, again, a sympathy and an allowance for certain activities, including subsistence whaling, rightfully so. So there's always the potential for exploitation of those loopholes, but we do collaborate, and that's a necessary part of coalition building within the Commission to ensure that those protections stay in place.
And who among those people that you talk to are your kind of friends, if you like, your best friends, the people you can rely on?
Well, that's a sketchy kind of a question, in the sense that sometimes alliances can change depending on the proposal. But I will give you an example in the role of governments on different issues, including the drive hunts. Last year, well, actually it was January, February timeframe, you might remember that after a large roundup of bottlenose dolphins in the Cove, that the U.S. ambassador to Japan, Carolyn Kennedy, actually tweeted her concern about the cruelty and inhumanity of the drive hunts. And that's really the first vocal, visible diplomatic overture that had occurred in putting drive hunts on the map, so to speak. And shortly thereafter, you had the UK, Australia, Scotland, Germany, Romanian ministers coming out against the drive hunts. And for the first time, we saw political conversation about the cruelty of the drive hunts. And hopefully that conversation is what can translate into real and concrete initiatives within the Commission. And that's what we hope to do and attempted to do. The small cetaceans, the toothed whales, the porpoises, the dolphins, they sometimes fall through the cracks at the Commission. There's a long-standing debate whether the Whaling Commission even has competency or a mandate to deal with small cetacean hunts. And so it's really critical to keep that conversation alive within the Whaling Commission. And there is a conservation committee that is increasingly focused on climate change, environmental threats, vessel strikes, entanglements, and a whole host of other threats beyond just whaling that has emerged within the Commission and is a very important and real part of the evolution of the Whaling Commission. So all of the pro whale or anti whaling contingent within the commission is important, and we collaborate and cultivate at all levels and at all times to ensure that that slim majority of pro whale countries stays at the top at the commission. But it's a delicate balance because Japan has been very successful in recruiting a lot of small landlocked countries just with their ability to provide subsidies and financial assistance. So it's a very interesting game at the commission, quite frankly.
Okay. So what do you think, what is the current situation with maybe sort of trying to stop vessels who are going out to whale, who are going out to kill whales, go on dolphin hunts? You know, is there a level of kind of sort of activism where, you know, pro-whale people are going out and trying to stop them actually happening on the seas?
Yeah, and I think you're speaking, you know, taking it upon themselves to intervene directly in these activities. And while we don't necessarily critique or address the activities of others, we can acknowledge, and I do acknowledge, that it is going to take the full spectrum of activities to address these hunts and these activities, and that includes showing up and being present, bearing witness to the hunts, like activists do in Taiji, where cruelty is exposed for the world to see. Direct intervention obviously comes at a risk to both human life and marine life, and so there's a delicate balance there in as far as supporting those types of activities that sometimes alienate local communities rather than to show up on their doorstep and protest their activities. So it takes the full spectrum of campaigning activities to address these hunts. There is no silver bullet. Obviously, the hunts are continuing. The activities in the Faroe Islands by Sea Shepherd, for instance, whether they have caused a reprieve in the hunting this season or not, it's debatable. But activists are being arrested and the hunts are being interrupted. And for some, that's enough, and for some, that is the goal. But the bigger picture is that the change has to come from within these countries, and some of those activities might not necessarily engender the kind of commitment and sympathy that we seek for that longer-term change. But at all times and at all levels, we're hoping to nurture that sentiment locally that lead to an evolution in the relationship between those communities and the whales, as they have in many communities that have disavowed and ended the whaling activities, but yet still can embrace the cultural importance. There are some communities in Japan that have stopped coastal whaling, but they still hold whale festivals and appreciate the whaling history, but they no longer kill whales. So, you know, there's a whole spectrum of evolution that can occur, and I really don't want to debate or speak to what is the most effective means to do that, because that might involve the critique or denigration of other campaigners' activities. But I will say that.
So what do you think about? I know you just said that you don't want to talk about it, but it happens, and it's kind of like some people might say, well, it's action. It looks like real action. It's on. I'm watching it. They're going to try and stop it. And I'm not saying a kind of diplomatic line isn't useful, but is there any?
Is very important, and bearing witness. There's a difference between showing up and documenting atrocity and cruelty and gathering data, and then intervening directly that risks violence and harm and injury. So there's a balance there, but I do think direct action is very important, and I think the public wants to see action. I think that's why many people since the Cove have traveled to Taiji. I think there's this need to bear witness, and sometimes it seems that's the most effective thing to do, is to show up and let your feelings and perspectives be known to the world, and let the media know about it. So it's complex, isn't it? But it's important I think, to take action and to reveal and document these activities.
Okay, so we're starting to get some questions in. Let's go to the first one, which is basically asking how endangered are the species which are being hunted at the moment?
Well, fin whales are critically endangered. They are on the IUCN highly endangered, is of great concern and has really brought international condemnation against Iceland for its continuing focus on fin whale. Pilot whales are data deficient, so like the bottlenose dolphin are considered data deficient. In some areas they are threatened or endangered. Subpopulations are endangered, but globally they might be considered stable or data deficient. It depends. If you look at Risso's dolphins and striped dolphins and spotted dolphins, the striped dolphin populations are depleted around Japan primarily because of the drive hunt activity, and that has been acknowledged by the International Whaling Commission. Minke whales are relatively stable population, which is what is used to justify those whaling activities, because minke whale populations seem to be stable around the world. And sei and Brutus whales that are hunted coastally in Japan, their status is a little bit less clear. So I guess my general answer is it depends. Localized populations are threatened or depleted. And that doesn't speak to other species that are hunted by the thousands, for instance, off Peru, the dusky dolphins that are used in the shark bait fishery, or the Boto river dolphins that are used in the Paracatinga fishery in the Amazon. Those populations, our localized populations, are critical in some instances. So it's not a blanket answer, and we'd have to look to each specific hunt and its specific target species to answer that more adequately.
Okay. Another question from Lisa, who asks, basically, what is the plan to stop this from happening?
Well, we need everybody to get on board through their own personal choices. If we're talking about drive hunts and the connection with captivity, we're seeking the public not to patronize captive facilities, because it does involve the extraction of wild dolphins and whales from places like Russia, where belugas and orcas are being captured still. If we go to other types of directed take, like whaling, those solutions are a little bit more complex. When there is a choice, such as if you're a tourist to a whaling nation, not to participate in sampling or eating our friends on a dinner plate, but instead taking a whale or dolphin watching trip to support the alternative and non-consumptive use of whales, support an organization that works actively and diligently in international and legal and political fora like WDC, that are engaged at the political level to change laws and regulations, and support our work to capacity build in many countries. We work in so many countries on the ground, empowering and funding local groups to take protection forward. That's the only way to do it, is to support the local organizations that are on the ground where these activities are happening. And then, in supermarkets as well, we're looking at consumer demand to shut down connections to whaling interests through the products that we choose and the products that are offered for sale in the supermarkets. We're, again, trying to shut down the ports that Iceland and Norway use to ship whale meat to Japan. It's much more cost efficient to send whale meat by seafaring vessel than by airplane or in the air. So we're trying to shut down the EU ports that have transited whale meat in the last few years. And that's a good start.
Okay, that's good. That's actually that's a very useful answer, because it answered the next question I was going to ask, which was about what we can do to help, basically. But that's good. There's quite a few tips in there. Another question is, do dolphins still get caught with tuna?
Yes, unfortunately they do. The association between dolphins, primarily spinner, in the eastern tropical Pacific is a discrete area where they associate with tuna schools. And so although the U.S. and the U.S. fishing fleet does adhere to dolphin-safe fishing methods where our fishing vessels do not encircle schools of dolphins to get the tuna beneath them, that doesn't happen elsewhere, and other countries are not complying, including Mexico. So those methods of purse seining that encircle schools of tuna through encircling pods of dolphins still occurs, and that's the unfortunate truth. And there has been a recent challenge to U.S. law that prohibits the import of tuna that has been caught by those methods in the World Trade Organization, and we will always be pressured to allow the trade with non-dolphin friendly methods out there, and so we have to stay strong as well within the WTO to prevent the erosion of those protections that we have. But yes, the tuna dolphin issue is still a problem, and those methods are still being utilized elsewhere.
And what happens to those dolphins when they're caught in those nets with the tuna?
Well, they either suffocate, drown, and can get crushed in the nets. Sometimes, of course, there's a back down process that brings the nets down and the dolphins are released. But through the trauma of the chase, the encirclement, and the roundup, similar to the processes that are used in Taiji, we know that, and the science has shown that there's capture myopathy, which is an erosion of muscle tissue that leads to death. And there's all sorts of physiological, psychological, emotional trauma that happens during those hunts, including separation of family members. So the tally's pretty high when those methods are used.
Okay. And I think just a final question, really, from me. Do you think this issue of whale and dolphin hunting is high enough up the global agenda? And if not, what is the one thing that is going to happen that's going to change that?
Wow, that's a tough question. I'd like to see it higher on the agenda, of course. I think that films like The Cove has helped raise the profile of some of these hunts. It's a constant battle. There seem to be no permanent victories in this onslaught on whales and dolphins. I mean, dolphin hunts occur opportunistically everywhere, and for local communities, and for local bait to be used in their fisheries. And it's hard to get a handle on the numbers or control them, and the only answer is to work at the local level to expose those hunts and then seek a remedy. But the one thing, gosh, I don't know if I can think of the one thing that might change the face of this battle. You know, if the video and the reality of the methods and the cruelty that's going on in Taiji is not enough, I'm disheartened to think, you know, where we sit with a variety of other threats to whales and dolphins out there, including bycatch that kills hundreds of thousands of whales and dolphins every year. So there's a spectrum of threats that are dire and that take action at so many different levels. So I don't think I can point to one thing that's going to put dolphin hunts on the map if, you know, the evidence hasn't done that already.
Okay. Courtney Vail from the WDC, thank you very much for joining us live from Arizona. That was the latest in our series, The Truth According To, which was WDC. Tomorrow we've got an interview. It's not live, but we're going to upload it tomorrow. We're going to interview the former SAS officer, Andy McNabb. We've already had plenty of questions come in. We're going to try and ask him all of the questions that have come in. But if you want to ask him some questions, get them in as soon as possible, and we'll throw them at him and see whether he can dodge them. But that's the latest live interview. Until tomorrow, we'll see you later.